I begin. So I learned a new expression, right? It's dobro jutro, boker tov, bonjour, good morning, or as they say in Jamaica, how you keeping? I begin with I'll thank Peter, Etienne for inviting me here, and of course Natalia Mashenovich, her wonderful husband Velibor, with whom I hung out last night, and of course Mama, Eleonora Prohish. Okay? And one of the things when we talk about Fanon, I'm going to talk about a few themes today, but one of the things I've argued is that if an intellectual has made a contribution, then in effect, it is how that work enables us to do our work. One of the things I've argued against, I don't have time to go into it right now, is against, for instance, black thinkers being locked in biographies. That ultimately, it would be weird to write about Kant or Hegel exclusively in terms of their biographies, for instance. If a thinker has something to say, the ideas can be engaged. So this is more building through some ideas that will contextualize Fanon. And it is true, this is the 50th anniversary of Fanon's death, 50th anniversary of Le Damné de la Terre, and there are a whole bunch of other anniversaries related to what I'll be talking about. But I'll begin first by mentioning when I was a graduate student. When I was a graduate student and I read philosophical texts, I remember noticing that a lot of the authors really didn't like black people. And I remembered when I would speak with my peers, their response was often with disbelief. They would say, what do you mean? That is not in those texts. And eventually, we will go and we'll look at the passages where we'll see the anti-black racism or the hatred of women. We would see these things in the texts. And their response was often, why didn't I see that? Now, one of the errors that they made when I would show that is they mistakenly thought I was arguing for the rejection of the text. And that's because they approached the texts in what I call a theodicy of the text. For those of you who are not familiar with theodicy, it's how do you account for the goodness, the compatibility of the goodness of God with God's omnipotence, God's power, and God's omniscience, God's knowledge. The two classic responses emerged from St. Augustine. And what St. Augustine argued was, one, we ultimately don't really know what God's will is and purpose. So God is fine, something's wrong with us. Or two, God has given us free will and we screwed it up. Now, in both accounts, the human being is the problem, not God. You see? Our problem, however, is when we deify authors of texts or deify the texts. Those responses that attempt to make the infelicities of the text external to the text function exactly like theodicy. If these authors are like God, then the problem is not with the text, it is with us. Now, this way of responding to the text has a kind of naivety. I was not under the delusion that my being a black man, opening texts by modern German and French and Anglophone thinkers would be to encounter books full of adoration of black people. What instead was clear to me was that it's precisely because I expected to read texts by human beings, I was willing to engage their imperfections. So in effect, my response was a call not for the elimination of the texts, but for really reading them. In other words, as Kierkegaard would say, it's not simply to see, but to see what we see. Okay? Now, this question about theodicy often takes a secular form of trying to render certain things invisible. In a way, it raises something connected to what I'll be talking about with violence. And that is the notion of illicit, illegal, or impermissible appearance. Okay? That relates, of course, to the problem of existence, because if you think about it, the word existence, in its etymology, means to stand out, to appear. So to say it doesn't exist is a way of trying to eradicate its appearance. Now, these kinds of issues are connected to what I call the problem of being a problem. To illustrate it, when Jean-Paul Sartre visited the United States in 1945, he went and met Richard Wright. And Richard Wright, when he met Jean-Paul Sartre, knew exactly where to take him. He took Sartre to Harlem because he knew Sartre loved jazz and he liked weed, right? And he wanted to meet a lot of black people. Well, when Sartre was in Harlem, Sartre turned to Richard Wright and he said, you know, Richard, could you tell me about the black problem? And Richard Wright responded, black problem? There's no black problem. There's a white problem. It's the attitude that many whites have toward black people. And Sartre realized, the problem in Europe is not a Jewish problem, it's the anti-Semites problem. And as you know, he returned and wrote Reflections sur la question juive. Now, this question about being a problem is something that's looked at in a lot of what's called Africana philosophy. It was observed by W.B. Du Bois and many others. It's when you look at the people as the cause of their problem instead of the problems faced by the people. And its structure is exactly similar to theodicy. Because if the state, if the society, just as with the text, is perfect, then the contradictions of the system must be external. And it must be that these external beings, these people who don't properly belong in the society, are the problem. Now, Fanon, one of the things about Fanon is that Fanon is one of those people who, there's a lot of, he makes a lot of people anxious and nervous. You're going to have a black man talking about violence, it's going to scare a lot of people. But in addition to that, he said a lot of things that he hoped he was wrong about. And we don't realize that much of his writing was a profound desire to be wrong. So we see this paradox, right? Many people want to be like Moses with the tablets coming down. I am right. But Fanon is one of those people, many black thinkers, in fact, look to the future and are pretty terrified and say, man, I hope I am wrong. Well, one of the things Fanon observed in his first book, Pour Noir Mas Blanc, was he made this observation. He said he noticed when he walked in a room, reason walked out. And what he was identifying was this problem of illicit or illegal appearance. In effect, reason in relation to him was being unreasonable. So in effect, this paradox of unreasonable reason is something he began to articulate. Now, of course, it gets tricky. Last night I was at a function for gender equality, and as we know in French, it's la raison. And so you could picture him, if she is shunning him, how does he force her to recognize him? It has the structure already of rape and violence. So he has this problem of having to reason with unreasonable reason reasonably. Okay? This brings me to the question that dovetails from Marcus's talk yesterday. Marcus's talk brought up this question of the philosophical anthropology, in effect, of dehumanization around the question of relationality. A thing that struck me in his talk is that he brought up what we could call an underlying metaphysical assumption of the way the human being is talked about that's connected a lot to the problem of violence. And that is many philosophical anthropologies, many theories about the human being, they ultimately rest upon Aristotelian metaphysics of substance. The Aristotelian metaphysics of substance asks what essentially is inside that makes the thing what it is. You see? But the problem is that intrinsic inside requires imagining the thing outside of any relationship with any other thing. It's in effect non-relationality. The problem, of course, is even to think about it is a relationship to that thing. So you, in effect, contradict yourself of having to be in a non-relation to relation about a non-relation. You see? This brings us to the fundamental anthropological problematic, that the human being has to be understood fundamentally in terms of relations, which means that the heart of violence is an effort to de-relation or take outside of relations the human being. In fact, almost every effort we think of as violence is to push the human being absolutely into the body as if the human being were an Aristotelian substance. Now, Fanon, in a concrete way, saw this, and many other thinkers have seen this, as the problem of philosophical anthropology. One of the ways racism, sexism, ethnic hatred, right, class massacre, what these things do is in effect to challenge the humanity of human beings. However, if your humanity is challenged, you defeat yourself by simply asserting your humanity as equal to your challenger. Because you would have in effect made the challenger the norm, the standard of your humanity. But what if that challenger is a low standard? In effect, if you come back to yourself as the standard, you face the same interrogative problem. And so we come to this question where the interrogation of norms, what yesterday's talked about as normativity and norms, comes right back, but it does so as a critique of the practices of justification. Okay? Now, this critique of the practices of justification bring us to something that was observed as well by Fanon. What many critics of Fanon don't understand is that Fanon detested violence. He actually hated violence. But one of the things, and he hated it so much that in Le Damné de la Terre, his last book, he has an entire section in which he showed how horrible violence can be by showing how people even not only kill their best friends, mothers, and others, but he raises the problem of the trauma of a nation inheriting, right? Inheriting its post-revolutionary or post-colonial situation born on violence. Now, there's a section in Penoir Mas Blanc when he talked about when he was doing anatomy, when he had to dissect a human body, and he said he couldn't do it. And he said, his professor said, pretend it's a cat. And we see an insight here about what happens, what's at stake when we begin to bring the human being outside of human relations. We begin to get into this question of the categories of beings that are replaceable. The other night when we were at the National Library, and I came out and I was looking at, it's my first visit to Serbia, my first visit to Belgrade. And I was thinking, what a beautiful city. And at that moment, as I looked at it in its everyday, its ordinary, it's just simple beauty, I tried to imagine the bombs coming down. And I began to think through the trauma of what that must have been, what must be about. I began to think about how do people in the midst of such situations as war, which many of you know, live? And it's something I've asked everywhere I travel, whether I've been in places ranging from Israel to Colombia to South Africa, all over. And many of you already know this. When people are in violent, traumatic situations, they try to articulate their sense of value in the ordinary, often through play. They often party very hard. And what they're trying to do is to, in their actions, affirm their responsibility for the irreplaceable. What people don't understand, for instance, is that when people are killed, as we're having in Afghanistan, Iraq right now, it's not simply that there's a statistic or a number in a scheme of replaceable digits. It's that people are losing loved ones. People are traumatized for life, their mothers, their sisters, their brothers. And so we come now to this, I'm doing it in a summarized way, we come now to this complex thing that was identified by Fanon in his analysis. When we talk about violence and we talk about racism and we talk about colonialism, we have a tendency to look at it within the framework of the self and the other dialectic. All right? People say, for instance, it's about, this problem of being the other. But what Fanon noticed was that, as when he talked about pretend it's a cat, there are certain schemes of production, just like the Theodician scheme, that literally will push certain groups of people outside of the self-other dialectic. It becomes literally a relation of non-self and non-others. We call it the zone of non-being. If you're not a self and you're not an other, then in effect, there's no ethical relationship with you. And if there's no ethical relationship with you, then it is possible to do anything to you without having responsibility for it. That's one of the reasons why extreme violence, as Balibar may formulate it, requires actions of pushing categories of human beings outside of human relations. Now, this raises a very big problem, particularly for political thought. If you look at much of normative political theory, the presumption is that you set the ethical conditions and moral relations for political life or for law. What Fanon pointed out, however, is if you are outside of those relations, then in effect, you are being asked to go into the ethical relations when in fact your entering is a violation of those relations. This means that you are in a situation of the political supervening over the ethical. Now, this creates a very unusual situation. It means you enter that realm as violence, you see? Because the violence is in effect your appearance, because you, within that framework, do not have the right to appear. If you think of colonialism proper, colonialism is a lot like the way Hegel talked about the problem of tragedy. The settler, the colonizer, or whoever functions as the status quo regards herself or himself as justly so, as correctly so, as having the right to it. That means those who have been disenfranchised, pushed out, if they assert getting that, it has the structure in that system of theft, violation, and as a consequence, is considered wrong. When I was in South Africa, for instance, there were people who wrote about the South African anti-apartheid struggle as nonviolent. There were people who wrote about the civil rights struggle in the United States as nonviolent. However, if you look at those struggles, black people were being tortured, killed, all along the way. Violence was only recognized as violence if whites were harmed. And that is precisely because the black people in those contexts, but it doesn't only have to be black people, it's whatever context that structure is, they were already considered not having the right to be in the public realm. So in effect then, it was futile for them to demonstrate the rhetoric of nonviolence. This subversion then becomes something that we have to struggle with if we're going to deal with the question of the subversion of political relations that emerged from the colonial condition. Now, today, and this is where I'm just going to, because I was informed, it's 20 minutes.
Go.
Today, we face a very unusual situation. We have faced the erosion of the forms of political relations that enable most people to appear as political agents. In effect, what is happening is the radicalization of what Amy Césaire pointed out as the value system of the colonial era. In yesterday's talks, Césaire was brought up, and Césaire, as we know, had referred to what happened in World War II as the value of Hitlerism. And what he meant by that was that what was considered legitimate treatment of the subjects in the colonies was brought back into Europe. Well, what we're finding now is a form of attack on the very notion of political relations themselves. In other words, if we outlaw political activity, political relations, more and more people become locked into their bodies, and the structural relation become one of ongoing violence. So in effect then, the question of the expansion of political rights, the extension of responding in the way the underside of modernity responded, becomes a problematic into how we're dealing with global conditions to come. Now, elsewhere, I talk about these as a conflict that is often set up as a false dilemma. The false dilemma is between the global and the local. So some people say, if they're fighting neoliberalism, they're going to have a localism. But what they miss is that there's a conflict between neoliberalism and neoconservatism about freezing history in the 19th and the 18th centuries. They are afraid of the 20th century because the 20th century was the age of revolutions. But of course, the 21st century has a very different kind of question, because the 21st century is facing the compression of temporality and spatiality. The world is smaller and time is accelerated. This means that if we're going to deal with the future, the philosophical anthropology question, the question of what are we, becomes back to us in such a way that we are now facing the question of understanding the global through the construction of new political relations. Now, why do I say the global? Is because it's naive to think that we can even articulate any localism any longer, because the very notion of the local as the local is a global notion. You see? This understanding then brings to the forefront Fanon's closing remark in Le Damné de la Terre. And it's interesting he chose damné, right? Be condemned or damned. Because he said it was not only the question of the material conditions, which we are already seeing in everything from the internet to the necessities of employment, to the constructions of how we deal with travel. But he also said, and this is an important role for intellectuals, this goes back to this point about making reason reasonable. He also said that we must take responsibility for the concepts by which humanity can actually articulate itself. Okay? And so it's with that note that I'll close. Thank you.